Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Tonight's broadcast is one of our oldest broadcasts. I think it might have been the second one that I ever broadcast in December of 2007. So this goes back a ways. It ended up becoming one of the chapters of my first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent. So I've obviously updated it since then. And as I always do when I rebroadcast these, I look back and see how my thinking may have evolved or I may have added to it. And that's what I bring to you tonight. I'm really excited about representing it and presenting some new information. We added this part to the title, parent work with a question mark. A lot of people ask me, we talk about this, and I should apologize for the therapy jargon that we all use in our field because there's a lot of it. And we say things like your work. What is your work? And so people ask me that question. So this is the analogy that I've developed over the years. I'll try to describe it to those of you that are listening on the podcast app because I use a kind of a visual representation. If you can imagine on a piece of paper a circle, and in that circle, that circle represents the ideal. I call it the Yoda, to take kind of a non-threatening, generic character. How Yoda would respond, how Yoda operates, how Yoda relates to people. This is the Yoda circle, the ideal. You can pick your own hero, but this is kind of the optimal way of responding to people. And it's a place and a way of being where self and connection are both valued. And this is important because this is often misunderstood, or people leave this idea out of it when they think about it. This is a boundaried place to be. This is a place where a person has healthy boundaries. And if you have healthy boundaries, that means that there are limits to your energy, limits to your capacity. So we have the circle that's the ideal, the Yoda circle, where self and connection are both valued and where a person is boundaried or has boundaries. The next idea is to talk about what is in that circle. And there are a lot of characteristics, behaviors, some aspects of personality, virtues that I would list in that. And what I've listed in this particular circle that I've drawn for you is calmness, curiosity, what neuropsychologists call response flexibility. That means that you're presented with input, some kind of stressor, some kind of event, and you have the ability to respond to it flexibly and intentionally. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. You have access to your creativity because the higher parts of your brain are communicating. They're online. You're not in this fight or flight mode when you're responding this way. So you have response flexibility. Um, you have um, you have a patient presentation, right? You're a patient person. Um, you're loving. You're clear. You're authentic. You're courageous. You're open. You're humble. I could list more, but those are some things: calm, curious, clear, authentic, courageous, open, humble. Right? That's if you can imagine how an enlightened person, even a fictitious enlightened person, somebody like Yoda would react. That's kind of the ideal. Then on the other side of the page, we have how you are, how I am, how I was yesterday or moments ago, how I tend to operate, my inclinations and proclivities. So it's my ideal on the one side of the page, my how I am, how I tend to be, and I call this the Darth Vader side. If we think of it as a continuum, and that's a reactive personality, angry, scared, intrusive, anxious, rigid, self-righteous, resentful, judgmental, and defensive. That's on one side of the page. Um, in the Darth Vader way, right is most important. And they tend to operate from a controlling or a smothering kind of mentality or a self neglectful place. So these are kind of two opposite sensibilities of ways of being. And simply put, your work is what is the space in between. Your work is, how do I get from how I was trained, how I'm wired, how I tend to react, what my history is of reacting to people that I care about, people that matter to me, to how I want to be or the ideal. And here's the important point: that space in between these two circles, your work, in other words, there's no judgment about that. It doesn't matter in some aspects how far apart they are. Obviously, the closer together they are, the more you are approximating the goal. But what matters more than even the distance is the work, the ownership. I talk about this all the time. You can be imperfect. You are imperfect. I am imperfect. It's about ownership. It's about owning and setting your project. And one of the shifts in parent education, the kind of parent education we do at Evoke, is the shift from making the child the project and making yourself the project. That you become the primary focus. You focus on what you can control. You focus on your response. You focus on those attributes that you lack, those ways that you regress. So when you're thinking about or planning for a visit to your child, some time at their therapeutic school, if your child isn't in treatment, a family reunion or vacation or holiday, what do you need to do to get from where you're inclined to respond and how you'd like to respond? And whatever it is in the middle is your work. It's skill building, right? It's insight and awareness adds to it. And as we talk about a great deal on all of these broadcasts, it's healing the wounds. We believe and talk about and teach often that the wound is manifested in the symptom. That if you have an unhealthy way of responding, a symptomatic way of responding, that has its origin, that has its roots in an unhealed wound or unhealed trauma. I wrote this today, and I wanted to share this when I think about the work that you have to do, because I was talking to a prospective parent today, and it just came up for me as we were talking about guilt. And it's this idea that you will often feel guilty for doing the right thing. A good portion of our work as parents is to sort out what our guilt is and where it comes from. And I constantly teach this. Our guilt is not an indication of morality. You will feel guilty on many occasions for doing the right thing for yourself and for those that you care about. Think about, for example, just telling the truth. That can cause you to feel guilt. Think about the various forms of self-care. That can feel guilty. Because when you are practicing self-care, it's often in competition with taking care of and being there for somebody else. So because we have limited resources as human beings, we're going to have to practice tolerating the guilt that comes with letting other people down, including our children. And maybe more importantly, in the big picture, them to us. They have to learn to let us down. They have to learn to not think that what we think and feel about them is about them. And this guilt, this idea that guilt is morality, that guilt tells us the right from the wrong, is completely erroneous. And I say this every time I do a broadcast on a subject like this, that everybody listening to me can imagine multiple examples, hypothetical or real, where they can picture themselves doing something that's the right thing to do, and that they're going to feel some kind of guilt or sadness that we call guilt related to the fact that somebody else is hurting or suffering or not having their needs met. And this comes from parent to child through the generations. And part of what we're trying to do at Evoke is break that cycle. kind of introduce people into a higher way of thinking about these things. I said in the journey of the heroic parent, guilt can undermine our confidence and erode our connection with our children, preventing us from allowing them to experience what they need to in order to stretch and grow. See, here's how it works. We grow up as children in families, in contexts where our parents and our caregivers tell us when they're upset or happy with us. And they do it with the explicit intention of trying to indicate to us that we're doing the right or the wrong thing. It's as simple as that. We tell children how we feel, and we want them to interpret that feeling of anger or disappointment or fear or anxiety or worry or happiness or joy or satisfaction or pride. We tell them that is how you know you're doing the right or the wrong thing. And then that child grows up with that programming, with that hardwiring in their brain, and they don't know where they stop and other people start. They don't know how to be in a relationship to truly to another person, because they respond to people the way they responded to their parents, which is, if you're upset with me, I've done something wrong. If you're happy with me, I've done something right. That is the recipe for peer pressure. That is the recipe for codependency, for a lack of differentiation. And then here's where it all comes home to roost. That child then grows up and has children. That's us. And before us, it was our parents. And after us, it'll be our children. That parent grows up and has children. And the primitive, simple child mind that we all still have deep down in our brains tells us that when our children are upset, that we've done something wrong. When they're happy, we've done something right. There's a book called The Narcissistic Dilemma that talks about how in previous generations, children worried about what parents thought about them. In today's generation, parents worry about what children think about them. And the point that I make when I reference this is, it's the same person doing the worrying. In that example, that flow chart, if you will, the same person is doing the worrying. They've just grown up and had children. So we've got to deprogram ourselves. We've got to find other sources of morality, other sources of strength, other sources of capacity. We've got to find peers and therapists and mentors. We've got to find philosophies, frankly, that don't lie to us about the principal ideas around morality. Otherwise, we'll go along like we're worried our children are, being blown by the wind and the whims of others. If you make it into Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous, you will hear the slogans like, what other people think about me is none of my business. And my serenity is my responsibility. Think about those two slogans. What other people think about me is none of my business. And my serenity is my responsibility. But here's the rub. What if that applies to parents? In other words, what if a child says, what you think about me is none of my business? And your serenity, they could say to us, based on this philosophy, your serenity, mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, stepmom, stepdad, your serenity is not my responsibility, it's yours. So don't hand it to me as if it's mine to take care of. You can make decisions around boundaries. In fact, it's inevitable. You must. Even if you don't set a boundary, you're communicating a boundary. We have the obligation to set boundaries in our lives to take care of ourselves. And then our children learn what it's like to live with an other person. We're teaching them. The philosophy at Evoke is something I'm obviously proud of, what we do and what we're trying to accomplish. It's not typical parent education. It's not, I mean, there are skills and there are tools for sure in what we teach, but it is a different kind of sensibility. It's a different way of being that most of us weren't taught. Not explicitly for sure, but not implicitly either. So we're learning to be different. I used to read this quote. I'm going to read to you in just a second. Um, I read this quote. In fact, I read it for many, many years at weekly parent meetings that we ran in our program. And some of you might have even read the Parallel Process by Chrissy Positek. She also took this quote because she worked for me and she did some of these parent meetings that was part of our curriculum. It's from a man named Henry T. Close that I don't know. I found in a book and I don't know who he is or what else he did, but this is something he said. This was my opening. Was my prologue to the weekly parenting group that visiting parents would attend. It says this: there is no question but that our parents failed us as parents. All parents fail their children, and ours were no exception. No parent is ever adequate enough for the job of being a parent, and there is no way not to fail at it. No parent ever has enough love or wisdom or maturity or patience. No parent ever succeeds completely. As kids, we needed more mothering than our mothers could give us, more fathering than our fathers had to offer, more brothering and sistering than we got from our siblings. Part of our task in growing up, thus, becomes finding our own sources of parenting to add to what our mothers and fathers were not able to give us. We cannot wait for our parents' permission to grow up. We need to decide on our own to find other people to parent us, to find other people to give us what our parents couldn't. To grow up isn't easy, but in order to do that, we must forgive our parents. We must forgive them for our sakes, not theirs. When we do not forgive them, we are still expecting all of our parenting from them. We are clinging to them in the hopes that if we wait long enough or do enough of the right things or make them feel guilty enough, they will finally come through with enough parenting for us. But this is impossible. And in order for us to be really free to find other sources of parenting, we must forgive. We must forgive them for our sakes, not theirs. One of the 5 or so most commonly asked questions by parents inquiring of our program or in the first few weeks of our program is, will my child forgive me? And I understand that question because I'm a parent. I'm a human parent also. But if we dissect that question a little bit, the question really that parents are asking is for them. Will my child, this is the crazy part, and we all have it. Will my child give me something that my parents weren't able to? Unconditional love. We're asking something from our children that we should have received in our parenthood, and in our childhood. That ideally, we would have received enough of in our childhood. But the answer to the question about forgiveness is children will forgive you when they grow up. It's part of letting go. It's part of the healing journey. Forgiveness is a liberation for them. It's not a clinging or a begging or a guilting kind of interaction. It's free. I'm not talking about forgetting or ignoring or denying the feelings, not that whitewashed version of forgiveness, but it's growing up. It's maturing. See, the thing is stuff happened to all of us. And if we are willing to do the work that we do at Evoke and say, I'm going to be generous with my child and tell them that I know that I hurt them, I dented them, right? That's what I talk about and invite parents to do all the time. If we have enough capacity and if we're willing to be generous with our children, we tell them that. But here's the thing. As they grow up, the dent and the bruises and the wounds are now theirs. And they have to heal them. The same is true, of course, of us. The dents and the bruises and the wounds are theirs. And they have to heal them. I spent 40 years of my life waiting for people to rescue me. Right? I was successful and functional by many people's definitions of those terms, but I still waited. I didn't realize that the person who was going to save me was me. I had to take some tremendously frightening and courageous stands in my life. J.D. Gill says, of course, no one has come from a perfect context, whatever that might be. Therefore, each person will have dents and bruises left over from earlier experiences. It is wise to consider all dents and bruises important and worthy of compassion and understanding. That's the work that we do in therapy. That's why the impact letter to mom and dad is arguably the single most important assignment at Evoke. Let's take whatever it is that you're angry about, whatever it is you're sad about, and any feeling in between or all around those feelings, and let's write that out. We're not going to worry about getting it perfect. We want it out. And if your parents are willing to, they'll read it. And if they can, they'll respond with capacity. They'll welcome it. They'll thank you for sending it. They'll thank you for exploring it. And if they make it to the next level, they'll actually consider those things. They'll become curious about what's true for them. But at least if they read it, we ask them to hear you. They don't have to agree with you. They just have to hear you. Hear and honor your experience. So let's talk about guilt. This idea of trying to be a perfect parent, when I read that quote about the perfect parent, I would ask parents what they thought. I'd say, how does this strike you? Some parents they were bothered by it. Some parents became defensive for their parents, which is just the evidence that they've been asked implicitly to carry around their parents' defenses all along. Some parents felt indicted by what I said, but most parents felt liberated. Most parents welcomed the permission to be human and to recognize that as humans, there's no way we can get it perfect. And see, when we do that, then our children can be mad at us. They can be sad with us. They can accuse us of failing. I've told this story before, but in the context of this broadcast, it's important. When my mother came up to me after a speech I gave in Orange County, California last year on parenting at a conference, she came up to my younger brother and I. I'm from Orange County, California. And she said, I'm beginning to think I should feel guilty for some of the ways that I raised you boys. And I said, as some of you will remember, I said, it would be nice. And I was thinking, especially for my younger brother, because he hasn't been to much therapy in his life. I said, it would be nice if you recognized the mistakes that you made. That would be a real gift for us. And I think even for you. But the guilt isn't necessary. I don't need it. That's something that you were taught that you were supposed to feel for being human. And that you, by the way, passed on to us. So the guilt isn't necessary. In fact, I told my mother, I think the guilt will get in the way of you seeing yourself clearly. Because you need to be a good parent who doesn't hurt her children. Because it was the most important role in your life. Because society tells you that we're a reflection of you, because that's what children are to the mother. That's what our society, the dominant culture, still tells us. You've learned to associate being human with feeling guilty. But it's not necessary. And as a matter of fact, I think it's probably going to prevent your awareness. We learn as we grow and become more whole. And being whole, by the way, doesn't mean be more good. Becoming whole means being who we are, which is talented, beautiful, smart, creative, effective, competent. All those things. It's also silly, ignorant, reactive, impatient. It's all those things. The more we become comfortable with us, the more this is important, the more we sit in contexts, in places with people who are okay with who we are, who respond to us with curiosity and non-judgment. And then we re-experience ourselves in that context. We internalize that to mean that we're okay, even when we mess up. When we come to understand, to heal, and know that who we are is okay, we realize that what the other person is saying and thinking and feeling is not about us. We can consider it as feedback if we would like, be curious about it. But that's by definition, that's what mental health is. By some people's definition, it's simply learning that other people's reactions to us is not about us. Most importantly, our children. What they think and feel about us is not necessarily about us. But here's what it sounds like. We don't say to people, well, that's not about me. You know what we say when we know it's not about us? This is the counterintuitive thing. When we know it's about us, this is what we say. I'm so sorry. I'm so glad you told me. I really want to understand what it's like for you. I'll see if I can find a way to do it differently. I'll look at it. Keep talking. I'm glad you're talking about it. Thanks for taking the risk to tell me. Keep talking. That's what it sounds like when we know we're okay. When we don't know we're okay, we tell people it's not our fault, or you shouldn't talk to me that way, or you need to say it in a more perfect I feel statement, or this is not the time, or how dare you speak to me, or what about you? On and on and on. When you feel good, you say, I'm sorry. When you feel bad, you argue with the other person about how right you are. Simple as that. Not confusing. I talk about this idea of writing your child a bad letter during our program because a lot of our communication while children are in wilderness therapy is letter writing, at least for the first part of the program or the majority of the program. And I talk about just write a bad letter. And what I'm trying to say is you can't get it right. Now, yes, if you want some coaching around tools, if you want some feedback around tools or insight, happy to give that to you. But this fear and anxiety that we have in our culture that it's possible to get it right. The epigraph and the audacity to be you says, from the Letters of Juliet says, why were each of us taught the notion of being correct when that exact notion ensured our failure in the world? The shift in psychotherapy is from thinking that the goal is to be good and right to being who you are. And by the way, just to be clear, who you are is all-knowing and full of light and love, right? It is, if you're okay. The enlightened ones, the Yodas, I don't want to pick any specific heroes, Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, right? The enlightened ones, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa. The enlightened ones are so good at laughing at themselves. They're so good at admitting their mistakes and apologizing. And you know what they're also the best at? Loving people. Being kind. Being generous. Being of service. We stop measuring ourselves by how our child responds. I spent a good part of the energy in my career trying to encourage parents to listen to their children, to hear them. But not all of it is feedback that you're going to change. It's for your consideration, right? And with your therapist or your sponsor or a trusted friend or mentor, you'll work those things out. But if a child merely is a reflection of us, we've reduced them to an object and they feel it. They feel and know that we're not really concerned for them. We're concerned for us, how we look. Every single parent who's honest with themselves can relate to a child throwing a tantrum, for example, in a grocery store. We've all had something like that. I have a tremendous amount of anxiety about my children in public, especially in circles where people know what I do for a living. I'm like, Oh my gosh, they're going to judge me. If my children aren't perfect angels, I deal with that same insecurity, that same anxiety. And I leak onto my children, like all of you, hoping that they will be good, so I will be approved of in these circles. But the project is that it's their life. And my job is to support them, to help them go where they need to go in their life, to find themselves. So we learn to humanize them. We don't reduce them to their behaviors. We don't hand them our shame and tell them to make us proud. Somebody said to me many, many years ago, if your program isn't about blaming parents, why do you talk about parenting so much? And there's a couple of reasons. Number one, you're more equipped cognitively than your children are. You all have full-size brains, right? Developmentally speaking, you've all had the opportunity to develop an entire adult brain, which comes in at around, give or take, around 25. You're more motivated than your child. And the ripple effects of a shift in parenting can have dramatic effects on others around them, including their children. And since control of children is not a valuable path for parenting, we're teaching you how to focus on what you can control. And then you're modeling it for the child. And you're releasing them. Here's the crazy thing that I learn in therapy all the time as a therapist and a client. We so often in our lives reinforce the very things that we complain about in our partners, in our employees, our colleagues, and our children. So part of it is to not become a part of the problem anymore. Shift, change the dance. Make sure that we're not inadvertently reinforcing something that we want to see disappear. Liberating us, bringing us joy, contentment, clarity, peace of mind, confidence. And you know that, just all those words, if one operates from those places, they become much more effective in their communication, in their relationship dynamics with others. They don't become a part of the problem. It's its own reward, right? Parenting is its own reward. And I found out years ago that the children who come to our program, they deserve to be here. But an hour spent with a parent is like 5 hours with a child because you can really retain it. Overall, you're a better student than they are if you're open to it. In systems theory, in family systems theory, we talk about punctuation. Punctuation about the beginning and end of a process is arbitrary in systems theory, right? It is the proverbial chicken and the egg. And your decision about where to punctuate it is arbitrary. Dad is reactive. Child shuts down. Dad gets angrier. Child escapes more and more into himself. Right? We could talk about it from the aspect that the child, the young man or woman, is causing trauma to the father, triggering the father's fear and anxiety. So the father's reacting from that place, which is then presenting a threat to the child, and the child shuts down more and more. We could start with the child if we want to, or we could start with the parent. It doesn't matter. It's arbitrary. In systems theory, the way out of a pattern is out. It's a fundamental shift, a transformation that is deeper and more fundamental than simple skill building. Here's a quote from The Journey of the Heroic Parent. It is remarkable how often guilt and shame prevent rather than encourage parents and children to do the right thing. Guilt makes us pay too much attention to how others feel about us rather than focusing on what's the best course of action for ourselves. I encourage parents to feel the guilt and do the right thing anyway. We are not responsible for what others think about us, including our children. We're responsible for our own actions, for being good parents and being good people. In turn, our children are responsible for the way they choose to respond. Don't engage in the cycle of dependence. Let them feel or think about you what they want. It's not about your kids loving you or not. It's about you loving them. And loving them means you sometimes have to do difficult things, even things that might make them hate you. As parents, we need to tolerate guilt in order to do the right things for our children. When I first became a wilderness therapist, I was struck by the constant conversation I was having with teenagers, where they were telling me one version of or another of my parents suck. And at first, my temptation, my inclination was to try to figure out where the truth was. Interview the child, interview the parent, look at the letters back and forth, and try to assign a percentage of blame to the problem. And then I realized I was playing into the game. And I came away with this idea of idiocy. And I would say to students in the field, I believe you. I believe your parents are idiots. And I'm an idiot. And you're an idiot. And your professors, your teachers, your girlfriends and boyfriends, your friends, your colleagues, your employees, your bosses, they're idiots too. So the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? Now, you don't say that in the first session, but you exude that. You exude it by not arguing. You exude it by not trying to find the percentage of blame and where it lies. You take it as a given that children hurt parents, and that children hurt parents, and the parents hurt children, and that spouses hurt each other. I had a client ask me this week. They said to me, we were speaking specifically about our political climate in our country right now, and my client was asking me. She said, "Do you sit on the fence? Must be really hard because I'm sure you talk to clients from both sides of the aisle. Do you straddle the fence? Do you sit? What do you do? How do you do that?" And I said, "That's a really good question." I said, "I think I try to get enough of a perspective. If you could think about like a drone, kind of climbing in an altitude off the earth, and if you get high enough, you can't see any fences, right? Everybody's the same. You just see scared, hurt, pain, sadness, fear, anxiety, love. You see capacity or lack of it. And so the perspective is life is difficult. Marriage is difficult. Parenting is difficult. It's impossible. Being a child today is really difficult. And true love as a therapist or a mother or a father is in our capacity to hold space for each other. And that capacity is built on a foundation of appropriate, healthy self-care, of having and being boundary. And we don't know how to do it because it wasn't shown to us. We were taught, virtually all of us were taught, that parenting was an exercise in molding children in the way that we think that they should be. We learn to forgive ourselves and we give our child back the responsibility for their lives. Not with speeches or lectures or telling them it's their responsibility, but by letting them be upset or angry. A couple years ago in New York, after my son made a surprise visit to the parent meeting, he asked, after he left, the group asked, excuse me, the group asked while he was there. They said, "Did you forgive your father for what he did? Were you angry?" He couldn't remember feeling any of those feelings. And after he left, I said to them, I explained, I said, it wouldn't have mattered. And I have a lot of faults, but this isn't one of them. It wouldn't have mattered if he was angry or unforgiving of me. And because it didn't matter, he was allowed to feel what he felt. That's the work. I'm not always there. I have days and moments in each day where I'm not there. But that's the work to get there. So we give our children's resentment back to them by letting it move through us. If it becomes your goal to get your child to think or feel something, you are being intrusive. That's different than having boundaries. You can't yell at me or hit me or steal from me. That's a boundary. I won't tolerate the drinking. Those are boundaries. But getting them to feel or think a certain way is intrusion. You let them have their feelings. You give them that gift out of generosity and love and capacity. Somebody said to me one time, if not guilt, then why? I was actually teaching a lesson at a church about this principle. I don't know how well it was going over. One of the participants raised his hand and said, I went to law school. And in law school, we had to visit San Quentin, I believe, was where they went. And I talked to this inmate who had robbed somebody at gunpoint at a convenience store for $250 and then shot them. And I was so shocked by the story. I asked him, this lawyer told me, I asked him, what did you do afterwards? Assuming that he would be tormented with guilt. And the gentleman said to him, I just went home and went to bed. In fact, he said, I slept a little bit well because I had money for the next day. So the lawyer turned to me and said, so if not for guilt, then what? And the answer is love. We do it for love. We do it for compassion. We do it for empathy. And it's born out of our capacity to feel. The way to teach children morality is teach them how to feel. Respect and honor how they feel. And when children learn to feel, when people learn to feel, they recognize feelings in others and they're sensitive to them. When children learn not to feel, and in cases of severe trauma or abuse or a very discounting context that can happen in severe ways, when children are taught not to feel, or they learn not to feel just to survive tremendous trauma, then they hurt other people without any regret or remorse. Because other people must be like them. And if they don't feel, if they're the equivalent of a stone or cement, non-feeling things, if they're not feeling things, and so is everybody else not a feeling thing. So the way to teach empathy, the way to teach morality is teach people how to feel deeply. Many of history's greatest thinkers have been able to look at their own idiocies. Self-esteem, true self-esteem, is not being convinced of your greatness, but rather accepting that you are still strong and worthy of love in spite of your failings. This position is helpful when somebody criticizes you as you are neither destroyed by one's judgment nor do you become defensive. The idiot intervention, just accepting the fact that you're an idiot or a human, the idiot intervention that I proposed in The Journey of the Rogue Parent is one of the best ways to end a debate since you are agreeing with one of your child's most repeated hypotheses. If you agree that you're a numbskull, you'll end conversations because that's one of the points your child is trying to make. But what you will be grasping onto and holding on to is that you're a person. I used to have at the end of every presentation for many years, I used to have a slide that said not cause and effect. Because as I was teaching these things, I would get emails from people telling me they felt so guilty after watching my broadcasts live. And it really bothered me. I didn't know what was going on. Didn't know how to do it. So I had, as a reminder, I had at the end of every broadcast, not cause and effect. And it's this philosophy, and I borrow a quote from Immanuel Kant. Talk about parenting as an end, not a means to an end. There's a kind of a coincidence about good parenting and good kids. There's a book out there called Not by Chance. This is kind of the opposite philosophy. Kant said this: act in such a way that you treat humanity, or act in such a way that you treat your children. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. In other words, people are not objects. We don't want to objectify them. And like I mentioned earlier, we objectify people when we have felt objectified. We dehumanize others when we have been dehumanized. That's the cycle of crime and violence in our culture, right? That's what we do with othering. So in this way of thinking, we love. We don't try to make somebody feel loved because that's controlling. We love. We care. We don't try to make somebody feel cared about. We just care. We show up courageously, authentically, and we turn over to others their agency, their choice about how to respond. I had a boy one time that was convinced in his mind, he told the story that his parents didn't care about him. His parents wrote that first letter and he said something about his father. My father doesn't care about me. And I don't usually do this, but in this instance, I was inspired to. I said to this, I said, you know, your father's been calling me every day for the first week that you were here, literally. And I told him that I couldn't keep doing that. I didn't have the time to talk to him every day. So I invited him to take you home or to come out here and see one of the groups, spend a day with the group to see what we do and what it's like. So he came and he actually brought your brother. And they spent a day in a group. And after leaving, they were convinced that we were here to help. I said, your father is tortured by guilt and fear. And he's spent most of his life trying not to be his father and trying to prove to you that he's a loving father. So I said to this young man, I said, I don't think there's a way that we can prove to you that your father loves you. You're going to have to figure it out yourself. And I think that this dance that you and your father have been doing for years, where he's trying to prove to you that he's a loving father, I think it's allowed you to hold him hostage. Because when you haven't gotten your way or you've suffered or you want to be rescued, you accuse your father of not loving you and he drops everything. And we're going to work on that, which we did and which they did. And he's doing well to this day. And that was about 12 years ago. Relationships with other humans are more like a dance and less like a light switch. A light switch on my wall has no choice but to respond to my touch. A dance is something we do together. When we treat people like light switches, like we can, give me the tricks, the tools, the clever ideas to manipulate my child for good, We dehumanize them. And we do it, like I said, people dehumanize people because they have felt dehumanized. The serenity prayer that some of you might know by heart or have heard. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's an idea about how to be with people. I used to ask this question at the same parent meeting that I taught every week for many years. I used to ask the parents, who's in charge of you getting a raise at work? Your boss or you, assuming you work for somebody? Who's in charge of you getting a raise at work? And most parents, not all of them, but most would raise their hand and say, I'm in charge. Right? Most parents that I work with are very self-actualized. They want, they have a lot of self-efficacy. They're capable people. So I'm in charge. They raise their hand, I'm in charge. And I say to them, is it possible to be an outstanding employee and not get any raises? And of course, everybody has to agree with that. Of course, it's possible. And I said, is it possible to be a horrible employee and get lots of raises? And everybody agrees. Of course, that's possible. And many people have examples of both in their professional careers. So then I re-asked the question. I'd say, who's responsible for you getting a raise at work then? And the answer is your boss. It doesn't even make sense to argue. But we have such a delusion of control that we think we can control how other people behave and react. Now, it is a boss's job to reward good workers, people doing a good job. And if they're bad at their job, it's their boss's job to fire them or replace them or train them. Your job is to show up at work, to do your job, to have integrity, to make use of whatever skill set the job asks of you. That's your job. And if your boss can't recognize it, you have options to go elsewhere and look for other work. But we are so good. We have been trained to believe this idea about humans and human relationships where we believe in the illusion of control. I won't go too far down the Star Wars path. But let me be clear. Darth Vader thought he was the solution, not the problem. Darth Vader's mother died. And then in the third episode of George Lucas's story, in the third episode, his wife died. And that was enough for him. He didn't want to hurt anymore, and he didn't want anyone else to hurt anymore. And so his solution was control. I'm going to control everybody and everything to prevent pain. Now, it's confusing to us because he's wearing black with a black shiny hat and a really deep breathing sound and a deep voice, voiced by James Earl Jones to sound menacing. He does kill entire planets, but he thinks it's for the greater good. And George Lucas, it wasn't a movie. George Lucas was teaching us the philosophical ideas of Joseph Campbell, the great American mythologist. And he was showing us the two sensibilities that exist in the universe, love and fear. And like Yoda said, fear leads to hate, and hate leads to misery, to darkness. I always ask I said I wasn't going to go down the Star Wars path, and I'm doing it. I then asked the question, what did Yoda do when something hurt him? And the answer was he cried. Yoda felt it. Speaking of cause and effect, when a parent, this is from the journey of the heroic parent, when a parent says to me during a lecture, but I did all of this. I'm not perfect, but I was a pretty good parent. My response to them is, congratulations. You must have a great deal of peace. Serenity and peace are the result of healthy parenting, not well-behaved children. The question you have about getting it right suggests that doing it right causes someone else to change. I am sure you were great, and your child's struggles are not about you, their struggles are their own. I talk about this in codependency, in the context of codependency and the audacity to be you. Healing your codependency doesn't fix your child. And I believe that sometimes in our field we teach that, and it's wrong. Healing codependency doesn't fix your child. Healing codependency only fixes your codependency. And the idea that if you heal your codependency and get your boundaries right and communicate perfectly, that you can somehow do all of it so well that your child will be fixed is the problem. The idea itself is the essence of codependency, the lack of boundariedness. I work with many parents whose children experience addiction problems, and they ask me, since my child is struggling with drugs and alcohol, do I have to be sober in order to create boundaries? My response to that is typically no. If you're drinking too much, or if you're using drugs, then we can talk about that as a separate issue. But if you're thinking about not drinking strictly so that your child will not have an excuse to drink, then you're shifting their accountability onto you. In other words, you are creating a culture in your family that says your child cannot be held accountable for his actions unless you do everything right too. I've seen this with parents. I've seen parents become resentful who have made large strides and believe that there were strings of obligation attached to their child to get better. I've talked about the idea of objectification. Objectification is when the child becomes our mirror. Equifinality is a punctuation idea. It means that some things can have similar ends with different beginnings. You can be abused as a child or have a wonderful childhood and end up as a social worker helping abused children. Equal potentiality means you can have the same start and very different outcomes. Systems theory, computers, and general systems theory taught us in the 1960s and 70s that things were more complicated than we thought. They're not additive. Systems are a multiplication of all that is in it. It is the basic adage of the basic saying of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. A parent said to me many years ago, after describing several traumas that their young grandson had experienced, and they were profound, said during an introduction, that is why he is here. That's why he's at your program. And I said, that's not why he's here. He's here because those wounds, those traumas are being manifested with aggression and substance use. Those are tremendously sad. And they need our attention. We're going to teach him how to feel those things. Those things, sadly, are part of his story. But he's here because he doesn't know how to feel. He's expressing those things in a sideways manner. Listen to your children, connect to them, and learn to let the feelings and the thoughts pass through you. I try to avoid the cause and effect thinking, talking to people about being good parents in the context of raising good children. The two things are separate, and I discourage this harmful way of thinking. The outcome of healthy parenting, like I said, is its own reward. Peace, clarity, confidence, serenity. Not well-behaved children. As we become accountable, as we make ourselves the project, as we take on these ideas, as we develop and evolve, and we will make mistakes even as we go along, and we'll be more aware of our mistakes and more open to our mistakes. We naturally teach accountability to our children. And a child's esteem can be dented by our guilt. They can take it on as theirs. We can hand it to them. So we learn to be accountable without the shame and the guilt, without the blame. We learn to be human. I had a parent say one time, after her son made all kinds of excuses for lying, accusing her of several things about where she had manipulated him and judged him and his friends growing up. And I was waiting to see what she said. And she said at the end of his complaint, she said, "You're right. I did that. All of that." And he relaxed. And after he left the session, the mother said to me, "But Brad, how do we teach him accountability?" And I said, "You just did. You just did." I want to tell you all of this. Whatever mistakes you've made, it's because you're wounded. It's as silly to become angry at your woundedness as it is to become angry at the child for their woundedness. We don't tell our children how we feel so that they are responsible. We tell them how we feel so we can be present with them and more intentional in our response. And we look to our past, and we invite your children to do the same. We look to our past, to our roots, not for excuses, but for understanding. And when understanding is found, there is a grace that comes. We don't look back to get stuck there. We look back so we can move through it all. We look back so we can heal and live. And lastly, we can say we are sorry when we fail, and we all will. Every parent has limits, and every child will discover the end of those limits. When we can say we're sorry when we fall short of this ideal, and with this apology, the child learns perhaps the most important lesson of all: what it means to be human. The work that you're doing is a gift to your child. We're keeping them safe. We're doing our best to help them. I'm giving them the same exact speech that I'm giving to you, or their therapists are. You give them the capacity to heal your childhood wound so they don't have to heal your childhood wound. So then they get to be themselves. You find other sources of support: sponsors, therapists, mentors. One time at a wedding, an older gentleman said, if one of you is not, he said, give advice at a wedding dinner or brunch. He said to the bride and the groom, if you're not fighting, one of you is an idiot. It's good even when it's hard. I mean, even when it's good, it's hard. And just remember, the guilt is the barrier to awareness, one of the barriers. I'm going to postpone live questions for tonight because I've gone over. And then our amazing folks really not just using the skill and the tool, but really connecting it to attachment theory. We have, so just go to our website there, Custom Pursuits Trips. It's an adventure trip with our former field staff, field guides. So think of therapy, light, sober, fun. It can be something you set up in between your visits after you discharge from Evoke's Wilderness Therapy Program. We have wilderness therapy support groups for alumni parents. In fact, one is going on right now. And then we have also support groups for intensive alumni. Just email malia@evoketherapy.com. We invite all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups while their children are with us. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children Refuge Recovery.org, and NAMI.org are other places also to go. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You an Evoke Therapy Podcast, or you can go to soundcloud.com. We are on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Just search us using the handles Evoke Therapy or Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. If you want to learn more about a foundation that helps raise money for people that can't afford therapy, go to evokefamilyfoundation.org. And of course, our blog has new information. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. And like I said, I'll be doing a question and answer. That's not the right date. I think the right date is Cassidy will send out an invitation tomorrow morning. I think it's, what's today? Today's Tuesday or Thursday? Oh, it is Monday the 5th. That's right. I'm getting my days mixed up. The year's going by in such a strange way for all of us. So Monday, October 5th, 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Someone writes this. I'll just read this since it's not a question. So thankful for you and the gifts you continue to give us. So needed this tonight. New communication with my son is triggering my old stuff. So thankful for the new connection with my son and for the ability to contain his feelings. You taught me how to do this one day at a time. Thank you. It honestly is my honor. And my response is, it's something I get the privilege of relearning every week when I teach it to you. So thank you very much. All right, folks, have a great evening. Thank you on behalf of your children for attending. Hope you all are safe and well at home. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.